Hello friends, today I want to share my autumn book recommendations with you. And so I have some kind of general fall vibes, and then I have some books that range from a little bit creepy to full-on horror, and then some Victorian books as well. And there's going to be some overlap in some of those as well. And so I'll be pointing out all of those kind of genres as I go. And I also have it all kind of labeled in the timestamps as well. And so I'm going to be talking first about my TBR or pile possibilities really for the autumn. And then on the second part, I'm going to talk about book recommendations for books that I have read and would recommend. So you can find all of that in the timestamps like I mentioned. So let's get right into it. I am very excited about this pile of possibilities because it's made up of mostly my physical TBR. So that's kind of exciting to try to get through some of those books that are on my shelves. And so the first book I'm going to talk about is a memoir, and it's the only memoir in this list. And it's In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. And so this is a memoir that is all about her abusive relationship and marriage to another woman. And the chapters are very, very short, and each one kind of uses a different narrative trope. And then it's also in second person, and so she is referring to herself in the past as you. And so she'll say, you know, something like, you thought so-and-so, but you were wrong, that kind of thing. And I think there's this sort of metaphor of the dream house as a sort of idealized image or idea of a kind of safe haven, a home that's like a safe haven, a relationship that's a safe haven, but then turns very wrong and you know, like a hell, like a cage. And I just find that so interesting. All those different devices feel like, you know, they would create a certain kind of distance for the author so that she can more easily talk about these very difficult things that happen to her in her life. And then they also give, obviously, the book a very interesting kind of character and, you know, make a very interesting reading experience for the reader. So yeah, I'm very excited to get to this one. And then the next one is kind of medieval horror historical fiction, and it is Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh. So I don't know much about this book. I know it's divisive, but so are pretty much all of her other books. But I know that this follows the son of a shepherd whose father commits a crime, and then he gives his son to a local lord as atonement for that crime. And so it's about what happens after this boy goes to live in this lord's castle. And so I imagine it's going to be dark and grimy and probably gross, as you might expect if you've read anything from Otessa Moshfegh. And I have enjoyed her writing before, and so I'm excited to check it out and see what it's like. Next I have a manga, and it is Dracula Midnight Children by Shin-ichi Sakamoto. And I just think that this is a really interesting take on Dracula. I've only read this first volume, but there's 3 volumes out in English now, I believe. And so our main protagonist is Mina, a red-headed tomboy who is the only girl in an all-boys school in Victorian England. And she gets bullied by all the boys in her school, basically. Not just because she's a girl, but also because she is physically strong and smart. And one of the boys, named Luke, is this really beautiful, kind of frail boy who is mostly indifferent to her during the day, but at night he sleepwalks and turns into Lucy, who is best friends with Mina. And Mina seems to have very strong feelings for Lucy, and so do all the other boys. They are all very attached to Luke because he is very beautiful and effeminate. And then at the beginning of the book, Dracula arrives from the east, and he seems to be targeting Luke/Lucy. And so then, Mina and all of the other boys are gonna have to team together to keep Lucy/Luke safe. And so it's really interesting because it's clear that the manga is trying to address issues of gender, nationality, and class. And I think it's very commendable. It stumbles over itself a little bit with stereotypes and stuff, but I don't know. I mean, if you've read manga, you know how kind of unusual it is to even find an honest attempt at that. And so I just think it's really cool. And also the art in this is gorgeous. I'm gonna try to insert some clips of this because for the art alone, I do think it is just gorgeous to look at. But I do think it's definitely for horror fans. It does have some kind of gory and scary looking images in here, which I personally love, but I understand it's not going to be for everybody. But yes, I'm very excited to keep going with this. I have the other 2 volumes that are out, but I'll probably end up rereading the first volume, which I read last year, for a refresh. And they're on the shorter side anyway. But yes, I'm excited. I know it's going to get probably kind of weird and probably a little grotesque, but I'm here for that. So yeah. For the next book, I don't have a physical copy, but I'm very excited about it. I've heard so many people talk about it, and it is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. And so I know that this is a short story collection made up of fairy tale, folktale retellings that are kind of dark and feminist. And honestly, that's all I know about it. I think that's probably all I need to know about it. But yeah, so I've heard really amazing things, especially about the writing. So yeah, I'm excited to get to this one too. And sort of continuing with the folktale idea, I have Kappa by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. And this short book is a Japanese classic that was written in the 20s. And it is not horror, I don't think, but it does sound creepy. So this is told from the perspective of a patient at a lunatic asylum, and he recounts the story of how one day while he was hiking, he saw a kappa, and kappas are folktale creatures in Japanese folklore, and they kind of look like frogs with beaks, like this little guy. And like Alice, he chases him down a hole and finds himself in the world of the kappas. And it's all about his experiences there living with the kappas and what happens when he returns home back to the human world, that obviously eventually lands him in the lunatic asylum. And so I've seen that this can be interpreted as a satire, but that there are multiple ways that you can interpret it. And it just sounds like a fun, interesting read for the fall, I think. Next is a book that I don't have with me yet, but I have ordered, and I'm very excited to get it in the mail today. And it is Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And it's interesting. I learned about this book earlier in the year, and since then I have seen so many people mention it. It's funny, it's like when you become aware of something, you start seeing it everywhere, I guess. But yeah, I'm just really surprised that I had never heard of this book before, by a Mexican author, and it's so influential in Latin American writing, especially as one of the first books that kind of used magical realism. But anyway, so this follows Juan, who on his mother's deathbed promises to go meet his father Pedro Páramo in a town called Comala. And when he does, he finds that it is actually a ghost town. And so I believe that through kind of different narrative voices, you get to see different views of the town from kind of like the side of the living and from the side of the dead. And you also get to learn about his father's history, because he didn't know him before this, and sort of, I guess, what happened. And it's a short book, but I'm very excited about it because it's so influential. It's a book that kind of bombed when it was first released, and then it was kind of reassessed and inspired so many other authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And so yeah, it just seems like a very cool classic to become aware of and go ahead and read. And I'll be reading it in the original Spanish, so I'm also excited about that. Next, I have a book that I actually found at a bookstore earlier in the year, and I have been waiting for this spooky time of year to pick it up. And it is Ghosts by Edith Wharton. So this is a short story collection of ghost stories that were written in the 30s. And in these stories, she uses the supernatural to investigate violence within marriage, the horrors of aging, the rot at the root of new fortunes, and the darkness that stares back from the abyss of one's own soul. These are stories to send a cold shiver down one's spine, not to terrify. So I think that's a good description to go into it. And it sounds kind of perfect for spooky season, so I'm looking forward to that. Next, I'm going to move on to some Victorian books, and the first two are not spooky at all. So the first one is The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, and this one is actually a satire that dramatizes the kind of greed and dishonesty that he was seeing in society at the time, and more specifically in the literary world. And I honestly don't know much about it beyond that. And some people say that this is his best novel, and it would be my first novel, so maybe it's the right one to start with. I feel like I'm really going to enjoy Trollope's writing, and so yeah, I would really like to get to this before the end of the year at least. And I am thinking of probably listening to it on audiobook. Next, I have The Odd Women by George Gissing, and this one is social realism, all about women who chose to be independent at the end of the 19th century instead of marrying. And I think actually the blurb is really good, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. The impoverished Madden sisters are ill-equipped to support themselves when their father dies, and Monica sees her only chance of escape from a life of grinding misery in marriage. When she is befriended by two independent women who strive to educate single women to take control of their destinies, the choices that lie ahead of all of them are starkly defined. The Odd Women is a dramatic exploration of the dilemmas facing the single woman at the turn of the century. Set in grimy, fog-ridden London, the novel paints a vivid portrait of the hardships and inequalities in and outside of marriage, and of a society whose values are in flux. And so yeah, that sounds really interesting. I love this time period at the end of the 19th century when things were changing so much. I think it's fascinating. So yeah. Next, I have some Victorian horror, and the first one that I'm going to talk about is The Turn of the Screw. This actually has some other stories in this edition as well, but I'm thinking of just reading that novella, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So this follows a governess who is charged with taking care of two children who have lost their parents, and their uncle who has adopted them is not really interested in taking care of them, so she gives her full charge over them. But soon after she arrives in their home, she starts seeing this man and woman around the house, and she slowly starts to become convinced that they are ghosts. And it's all about what happens after that. So yeah, that sounds super creepy and intriguing. Next, I have this beautiful little edition of The Masque of the Red Death, and this is actually a short story collection, so there's more than just this story in there, and some of them I've read and some of them I haven't. And I think it'd be really neat to just read one every night for like a week or something. I can tell you which ones are in here. So besides The Masque of the Red Death, there's The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat, Ligeia, The Cask of Amontillado, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Telltale Heart. And one other book that I'm considering reading is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, because it is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. And that was actually a suggestion from Jen from Literary Love 123, is to pair The Fall of the House of Usher with What Moves the Dead. So What Moves the Dead is a modern retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. When Alex receives word that their childhood friend Madeline Usher is dying, they race to the ancestral home of the Ushers in a remote countryside. What they find there is a nightmare of fungal growths and possessed wildlife surrounding a dark, pulsing lake. Madeline sleepwalks and speaks in strange voices at night, and her brother Roderick is consumed with a mysterious malady of the nerves. And so Alex is going to have to try to figure out what's going on before it's too late. So yeah, that sounds like it might be a fun thing to pair along with this too. So now I'm going to move on to talking about some books that I have already read and would recommend. And I'm going to start with some kind of general fiction books. And the first one is one of my favorite books, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And so if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend you do. And this is a book where really knowing as little as possible is the best way to go, because part of what is so interesting about this book is kind of learning or coming to understand the context of the book as you go, and also coming to realize certain things along with the protagonist who's writing in first person as the story progresses as well. So this follows Kathy H., who is 31 at the start of the book, and it takes you back in time to get to know this relationship, complicated relationship with two other friends that she has had since they were children, when they were attending this very special school called Hailsham. And so it's really about their relationship and the circumstances that surround them. It's about memory and regret and the things that go unsaid. It is slow and beautiful and heartbreaking, but also short. So it won't take you very long to get through it. The next book is Lanny by Max Porter. And I don't know if anybody else would agree with me, but I feel a kind of warmth towards this book, similarly to the warmth that I feel towards Piranesi. They're very different books, but they have this kind of realist whimsy about them, I think, that somehow I find similarities there. But anyway, that's beside the point. So there's a few different kind of interesting things going on in this book. First, this takes place in a village an hour outside of London, and there's this kind of strange entity of nature called Dead Papa Toothwort that sort of watches over the village, and he's kind of ominous and strange and a little bit gross, but he sort of watches over the village. And in this village, there's a little boy called Lanny, and he is very whimsical, and he is adventurous and surrounded by a lot of adults that, are very concerned with their own issues and lives. And so one day, Lanny goes missing. And so this is all about how the village sort of has to come together to try to find Lanny. And this book has a very interesting mix of prose and verse. It's very sort of steeped in poetry. And so there's different sections in this that take different perspectives from different people in the village, because another aspect of this is that you hear from all the different people in the village, not just from those individual sections where you're hearing from their perspective, but you also get these very interesting kind of thoughts. So it's formatted very interestingly. You have this typesetting like this, where you have these words sort of sprawled all over the page, and these are all like thoughts or things being said around the village that let you in on what people in the village are thinking or saying and that kind of thing. And it gives this very interesting character to the village as a whole. And so whether you read it in this physical form and you have that kind of formatting to give you that idea of voices sort of floating around, or if you listen to it on audiobook, in the audiobook, I think there's more than one voice actor, and they do kind of different voices. And so whether you do this or that, they're both very interesting kind of interpretations of that. And so you get a very interesting mix of kind of prose and verse, and there's this whimsy about it. And going into it, I expected it to be darker than it ended up being. It surprised me with how much I enjoyed it, but also how heartwarming it was. and nowhere near as kind of dark as I thought it might end up being, which I think is a good thing. I really, really like that. So yeah, I think the joy in this is in that very interesting and whimsical kind of storytelling, and in getting attached to the different characters and this sort of overall character of the village as well. Next, I'm going to recommend Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, and I actually lost my physical copy of this book at some point during a move, unfortunately, but I actually listened to it originally in audio format, and I would really recommend that as well. So this follows Sylvie, a teen, who is accompanying her father and a group of students doing this reenactment for 2 weeks of Iron Age living in the north of England. And her father is very misogynist and oppressive, with like very traditional kind of views. And they're also poor. And so she feels very limited in her opportunities. But as this, kind of camping is going on, she gets to really observe the other students and think about how different their lives are, and it helps her start envisioning a different kind of future for herself. But as they continue to get immersed in this reenactment, things start to get really weird and kind of spiral out of control. And it's, about what happens after that. So that building of tension I found so intense and immersive in the audiobook. And that was, very much part of what I ended up enjoying so much about this. I really could not stop listening to it. Next, I have 2 mystery thrillers to talk to you about. And the first one is Mrs. March by Virginia Fato. And this is a psychological thriller. And this follows Mrs. March, who is the Upper East Side wife of George March, who is a very successful author. And his latest book is a big hit. And so one day, Mrs. March goes to pick up some bread from the bakery, like she does usually, and she's talking to the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper's, praising her husband's book. And then she suggests that the main character of his book might be based on Mrs. March. And this really causes her to have a mental breakdown. She really kind of starts to lose her mind, and it kind of lays bare all of this inner turmoil and insecurities and trauma. She becomes increasingly paranoid, and eventually we get to know more about the things in her past that have shaped her into, such an uncaring, pretentious kind of woman. So I just thought it was a really great character study of an unlikable character. And I personally just love stories about housewives. Next is A Helping Hand by Celia Dale. And this book is a little bit hard to define genre-wise because it's very tense and psychological, but it's kind of like a reverse mystery because it's not about who does it. It's more about seeing how it happens. And so on one side you have the Evanses, who are a couple that have just lost an older lady they were caretakers for, who has left them her estate in her will. And they were not related to her. They just really love taking care of elder ladies. And then on the other side, you have Mrs. Fingal, who lives with her niece by marriage. And she feels like her niece is not as attentive and caring as she would like her to be. Mrs. Fingal is financially independent, but she is getting up in years, and so she doesn't have the same level of mobility as she used to. And so this is all about how when these two groups end up meeting during a vacation in Italy, it becomes apparent to everybody that the Evanses should now take in Mrs. Fingal and take care of her. And so it's very evident that the Evanses have ulterior motives, but it's that slow playing out of events and seeing information get revealed and that kind of thing that creates this strong sense of like tension and dread as things escalate. And so I ended up really enjoying this. I don't want to say too much, but it's that slow psychological deterioration that takes place that is so harrowing and kind of heartbreaking. So I highly recommend this one too. Next, I have a classic Gothic novel, and it is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. And this is a Gothic mystery thriller, and it's quite a slow burn. And my unpopular opinion is that I actually like this better than Rebecca. I know that's not the case for most people, but it's the case for me. And so I do want to recommend it if you haven't read it yet. If you've maybe read Rebecca and you haven't read this, I would say try this out. So this follows the perspective of Philip, who is the ward of his cousin Ambrose, who has an estate in Cornwall. And they both live very comfortably as bachelors. But Ambrose is kind of sickly, and so at one point he has this prolonged stay in Italy for his health. And he writes back to Philip, eventually letting him know that he has met this distant cousin of theirs, the recent widow Rachel. And things get kind of strange through his letters as Philip learns that Ambrose's health is getting worse, and he's also becoming kind of infatuated with Rachel. And eventually he learns that they have married, and soon after Ambrose dies. And so Philip is really devastated, and then it turns out that Rachel is coming to England. And at first, Philip is very suspicious of Rachel, but then he starts to feel very attracted to her, and so things get very strange after that. And Philip, as a narrator, as a character, he sucks. I hated him, but I thought that his perspective was actually really interesting for telling the story because he is so biased and unreliable that it creates this looming uncertainty over everything that made it really fascinating. So yeah, I thought that the ambiguity was really fascinating, and my reading of it was actually like very feminist, and so I enjoyed it a lot. Next, I'm going to move on to some contemporary horror, and the first book is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I have to admit, this author has been pretty hit and miss for me. I've enjoyed some of the things I've read by her, and I have DNF'd some other things. But this book in particular, I really, really enjoyed. It just hit all the right notes for me, I guess. And this book gets pretty strange towards the end, but I actually ended up really enjoying all the weird things that happened. So this follows Noemi, who is a socialite in Mexico, and she is not ready to settle down like her father would like her to. But one day, a letter from her cousin Catalina makes her really worry because her cousin is very sick, and Noemi's father kind of worries that Catalina's husband, he's an English guy, is trying to kill her off for her money. And so he sends Noemi over to find out what's going on. And once Noemi is there, she actually doesn't get to see her cousin very much because she is so sick. And so she spends her time trying to find out more about her husband's family, who own the house, and there's been generations that lived there, and so she's trying to find out more about them. But then things start to kind of spiral when Noemi starts having these strange kind of visions and dreams, and she eventually uncovers the family's deepest, darkest secrets. And you know, it gets very weird and supernatural. And so this book really kind of explores the legacy of colonialism and exploitation, also patriarchy and feminism. And, you know, the vibes were through the roof, and then the weird was through the roof. But it just worked for me. I thought it was awesome. And also just a really fun, kind of dark read. So yeah. Next, I have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I read this last year, and I ended up enjoying it so much. This follows mainly two friends, Abby and Gretchen, who have been best friends since they were 10 years old. And when they're high school sophomores, they have this incident where they're hanging out with two other friends at a lake house, and they take some acid, and then when later in the day when it starts to kick in, Gretchen disappears in the woods, and then a few hours later she reappears looking very not okay, but she insists that nothing happened. But everything changes after that. And so it's about everything that happens after this. And it's such a great exploration of teenage friendship and of being a teen girl in general, I am really amazed with how good of a job I thought Grady Hendrix did at portraying this teen perspective. And so this does explore some feminist and queer themes, but I do think that it is largely about friendship. The majority of the book is on the slower side, especially the middle portion. It really focuses on this formation and then disintegration of Abby and Gretchen's friendship. But then later in the book, towards the end of the book, it really picks up, and there is some gruesome stuff, some violence, and so you might want to look up triggers. But this is also such a fun portal back to the 80s. I thought the dialogue was really good, the way that the teens talk to each other and stuff. It felt very immersive and also really fun. Also, this cover, amazing. Looks like a VHS. So yeah, I thought it was a really fun horror read. And also his other book, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, I read that as well. I ended up liking this more than that, but I also really enjoyed that book. That one is about a Southern book club in South Carolina. There's a housewife who joins a book club to kind of give her life a little bit more spice, but then there's this guy that comes into her town, and she starts to suspect that he is a vampire, and she is very concerned about, you know, the safety of her family, and it starts to alienate her from everybody that she loves. And so that was also a really fun book that also goes off the rails a little bit. do be warned. But yeah, either one is great for spooky season. Next, I have another medieval horror book, and this one is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. And I read this one earlier in the year, and I ended up really enjoying it. That's cool because it's kind of outside of my comfort zone. It's got some action and you know, supernatural things going on. But I think at the heart of it, it's also a book about friendship. So this is set during the Black Plague, and it's actually a road novel. And so we're following a disgraced knight, a mystic young girl, and a gay priest who is questioning his faith, that end up traveling together for reasons that they don't fully understand. And they run into a lot of dark adventures, but they also kind of make connections with each other that kind of help them deal with some of the darker things that have affected them in their pasts, as they're also trying to, you know, defend themselves in the present as very difficult things are happening. And in this story, the Black Plague has been brought on by fallen angels testing God by attacking the earth, because God has abandoned the earth and God keeps not responding. And so the fallen angels keep escalating their attacks, culminating in the Black Plague. And so, you know, it is dark, there is action and there's violence, but I also thought that it was really well balanced, because there's also a lot of levity in a lot of really kind of fun, bantery dialogue between the characters, and the bonds that they're forming with each other. You know, like some kind of brutal things do happen, but I didn't think that it was relentless. And I don't know, I don't prefer things to be easy anyway, so who knows? Maybe that's just me. But yeah, I ended up really enjoying this, and I'm looking forward to trying more things from Christopher Buehlman in the future. So those are all the books that I had to talk to you about. I did also want to mention that the books that I'm currently reading right now are, I think all of them are from my art-themed book recommendation videos that I have made recently, and I'm enjoying what I'm reading so much, but I'm not moving through them very quickly. But I think that's totally fine. Part of it is that I've also been spending more of my free time just working on personal art. I've just been sketching and painting for fun, and I've been enjoying that so much. And so, you know, I think that's pretty normal. If you have more than one hobby, to kind of have different ones sort of dominate a little bit more, or, you know, kind of fluctuate a little bit in a way. But yeah, I'm still very much in a kind of art mood as well. But it's really cool to have so many options to choose from. I'm really enjoying that. It's always nice to be able to satisfy wherever your mood takes you. So yeah, so do let me know what you are most excited to read this autumn, or you can let me know what you're reading right now if you'd like to. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.